Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. 3 hours had passed since the rain had stopped, but Sheriff Amos Reddick could still hear the sound of water dripping from the gutters of the county maintenance shed. It was late November, a Thursday night, 20 minutes past midnight. The air was so cold that with every breath he took, the inside of the windshield fogged up with a thin layer of mist. The heater in the patrol car had been making a strange squeaking noise for a week, so he had turned it off. Nothing illuminated the interior except for the dim light of the computer on the dashboard. As he continued typing the incident report with his stiff fingers, the outside had been enveloped in that peculiar darkness unique to rural nights. The moon, hidden behind clouds. The nearest streetlight 15 miles away from the town. Harlan County sat in the northwestern corner of Wyoming, where the high plains started their slow climb toward the mountains, and the wind never really stopped blowing. The county covered 2,400 square miles with a population that barely broke 8,000, most of them clustered in and around the county seat of Millerton, with the rest scattered across ranches and small communities connected by 2-lane highways that cut straight lines through landscape that looked the same in every direction. Amos had been sheriff here for 9 years. And before that he'd spent 6 years as a deputy, working his way up through a department that consisted of himself, 3 full-time deputies, 2 part-timers, and a dispatcher who worked the overnight shift from a windowless room in the basement of the courthouse that smelled like old coffee and electrical equipment that needed replacing. The incident report he was finishing involved a domestic disturbance call that had turned out to be nothing more than a husband and wife arguing loudly enough that their neighbor had heard it through the shared wall of their duplex and called it in worried that things might escalate. By the time Amos had arrived, the couple had already reconciled and were sitting at their kitchen table playing cards like nothing had happened, apologizing for the trouble and assuring him that everything was fine. It was the kind of call that took up more time in paperwork than it did in actual law enforcement. But it was also the kind of call that could turn deadly if you ignored it. So Amos treated every domestic disturbance with the same careful attention, regardless of how minor it seemed. He was 2 paragraphs from finishing the report when his radio crackled to life with the distinctive squelch that preceded a transmission from dispatch. Unit 12, this is dispatch. Amos keyed his mic. Go ahead, Willa. We've got a 911 call coming in from the county line. Caller is reporting a vehicle accident, but the location is showing as the old service road near the wind farm. Do you want me to send it to you or to Deputy Farnham? The wind farm sat right at the border between Harlan County and the neighboring county to the east. A development that had gone up 5 years ago despite significant local opposition, and had been causing problems ever since. Not accidents or mechanical failures, but strange complaints about noise, about the way the turbines affected radio reception, about livestock behaving oddly near the turbine bases. Amos had dismissed most of it as the usual resistance to change that came with any new development in rural areas, but he had to admit that the wind farm had a strange quality to it, particularly at night when the blinking red lights on top of each turbine created a rhythm that seemed designed to unsettle rather than warn. I'll take it, Amos said. What's the location? The call is showing as originating from the junction of County Road 18 and the Service Access Road. Caller reported a single vehicle off the road, possible injuries, but the connection was poor. I could barely make out what they were saying. Did you get a callback number? That's the strange part. The call came in on a landline, not a cell. The system is showing it as originating from the old telephone pole at mile marker 7, but that line was disconnected 3 years ago when they upgraded the system. Amos felt something cold settle in his stomach. Willa, are you telling me we're getting 911 calls from a phone line that doesn't exist anymore? I'm telling you that's what the system shows. I tried calling back, but the number just rings. No answer, no voicemail, nothing. He saved his incident report and started his patrol unit, pulling back onto the county road and heading east toward the wind farm. The service road Willa had mentioned was a maintenance access that ran along the southern edge of the turbine development, connecting the turbines to the main county road and providing access for repair crews when something needed maintenance. It was unpaved, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and rarely used outside of scheduled maintenance visits. The idea that someone would be driving it at midnight in late November seemed unlikely, but accidents happened in unlikely places, and Amos had learned long ago not to make assumptions about what people would or wouldn't do. The drive took him through flat grassland that stretched away on both sides of the road, punctuated occasionally by fence lines and the dark shapes of cattle bunched together for warmth. The clouds that had dropped rain earlier in the evening were breaking up, allowing occasional glimpses of stars and a thin crescent moon that provided just enough light to make the landscape look even more desolate. As he got closer to the wind farm, the turbines became visible as darker shapes against the dark sky, their blinking red warning lights creating a pattern that seemed almost hypnotic if you watched it too long. His radio crackled again. Unit 12, dispatch. Go ahead. I'm getting another call from the same location. Same voice, same report of an accident, but the caller keeps breaking up. It sounds like they're saying there are multiple vehicles now. Amos pressed harder on the accelerator. Copy that. I'm about 5 minutes out. Willa, can you get Deputy Farnham to respond as backup? Already done. He's coming from the north side. Should arrive about the same time you do. The wind had picked up, buffeting the patrol unit hard enough that Amos had to correct his steering to keep from drifting. The sound of it was constant now, a low moan that seemed to resonate through the vehicle's frame and set his teeth on edge. As he approached the junction where the service road met County Road 18, he could see the wind turbines more clearly. Massive white towers rising 200 feet into the air with 3-bladed rotors that swept through their circuits with a rhythmic whoosh that was audible even over the wind and the sound of his engine. He slowed as he reached the junction, scanning the area with his spotlight for any sign of a vehicle off the road. The service road stretched away to his right, a pale strip of graded earth that disappeared into darkness between the rows of turbines. On his left, the county road continued east toward the neighboring county, empty as far as he could see. There was no vehicle, no accident, no sign that anyone had been here recently. He pulled onto the service road and continued slowly, his spotlight sweeping back and forth across the ditches on either side. The turbines were closer now, close enough that he could hear the mechanical sound they made as the rotors turned, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into his chest. The red warning lights blinked in sequence, creating a rhythm that made it difficult to judge distance or movement. Unit 12, this is Unit 7. Deputy Lyle Farnham's voice came through clearly despite the interference that had been affecting radio transmission since Amos had gotten close to the wind farm. Go ahead, Lyle. I'm approaching from the north access. Any sign of the accident? Negative. I'm about a quarter mile in on the service road and I haven't seen anything yet. Amos continued forward, passing the first row of turbines and entering the interior of the wind farm where the access road wound between the massive structures in a pattern that seemed deliberately confusing. The turbines were spaced about half a mile apart, creating a grid that extended for several square miles across what had once been rangeland. In daylight, the wind farm had a sterile, industrial quality that clashed with the surrounding landscape. At night, it felt like something else entirely, like a forest of alien structures that had been planted for purposes no one quite understood. His radio crackled with static, and through the interference he could hear Willa's voice distorted but understandable. Unit 12, I'm getting another call. Same location. Caller says they can see your lights. Amos felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He scanned the area around him looking for any sign of another vehicle or a person, but there was nothing except the turbines and the darkness between them and the wind that made everything move in ways that suggested presence where there was none. Willa, confirm the caller can see my vehicle. That's what they said. They described a sheriff's unit with its spotlight on moving along the service road. They're asking for help. Amos keyed his mic. Willa, I want you to keep that caller on the line and try to get more specific information about their location. Ask them what they can see besides my unit. Hold on. There was silence for almost a minute, and then Willa came back, her voice uncertain. Sheriff, the caller says they're at the telephone pole at mile marker 7. They say they've been calling for help for hours, but no one will answer. The telephone pole at mile marker 7 was directly ahead, visible in Amos's headlights as he rounded a curve in the service road. It was an old wooden pole that dated back to when the area had still been active rangeland, now leaning slightly and wrapped with faded orange tape that marked it for removal. The telephone line that had once connected it to the network had been cut and coiled at the base of the pole 3 years ago when the phone company had upgraded to a buried fiber system that serviced the wind farm's monitoring equipment. There was no phone attached to the pole, no way for anyone to make a call from this location. And yet, according to the 911 system, that's exactly where the calls were coming from. Amos stopped his vehicle about 50 feet from the pole and stepped out, immediately regretting it as the wind hit him with enough force to make him stagger. The sound of the turbines was overwhelming this close, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with his heartbeat and make it difficult to concentrate. He approached the pole with his flashlight, scanning the area for any sign that someone had been here recently, but the ground was undisturbed except for his own footprints. The old telephone line lay in a coil at the base of the pole, exactly where it had been left 3 years ago. The copper wire oxidized and obviously disconnected from any network. Unit 7, this is Unit 12. He had to raise his voice to be heard over the wind and the turbines. Go ahead, I'm at mile marker 7. There's no one here and the telephone line is definitely disconnected. Any sign of an accident? Negative. The area is clear. Static washed through his radio and then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, faint and distorted, speaking over the radio frequency without any call sign or identification. Please, we need help. There's been an accident. Multiple vehicles. People are injured. We've been calling for hours. Why won't anyone answer? The voice was wrong. It had the quality of a recording played back at slightly incorrect speed, words stretching and compressing in ways that made them sound almost but not quite human. Amos keyed his mic. This is Sheriff Reddick. Identify yourself and give me your exact location. The static increased, and through it he could hear what sounded like multiple voices now, all talking over each other, all saying variations of the same thing. Accident, need help, been calling for hours, why won't anyone answer? The voices faded in and out with the rhythm of the turbine blades passing overhead, creating a pattern that was almost musical in its regularity. Deputy Farnham's unit appeared from the northern access road, headlights cutting through the darkness as Lyle pulled up next to Amos's vehicle and got out. His expression was troubled as he approached, one hand on his radio. Sheriff, are you hearing this on your radio? Amos nodded, multiple voices all reporting the same thing. Lyle looked toward the telephone pole. Dispatch says the calls are coming from that pole, but that's impossible. The line's been dead for years. Amos walked over to the pole and examined it more carefully with his flashlight. The old telephone box was still attached about 5 feet up the pole, a gray metal container that had once housed the connection hardware for the landline. He reached up and opened it, the hinges protesting with rust. Inside, the connections were exactly as he expected. Copper wires cut clean and curled back on themselves. No power, no signal, no way for this box to connect to anything. His radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, close enough that it sounded like someone standing right next to him. "We can see you looking at the phone. Why won't you help us? There's been an accident. People are dying, please." Amos spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the area, but there was no one there. Just Lyle standing by the vehicles, his own flashlight out and scanning the darkness between the turbines. The wind had died down suddenly, creating a pocket of stillness that felt more unsettling than the constant buffeting had been. In the silence, Amos could hear something else, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A low-frequency hum that was just at the edge of hearing, more felt than heard, vibrating through his bones and making his vision blur slightly at the edges. Lyle walked over, his expression grim. "Sheriff, I think we should get out of here. Something's not right." Before Amos could respond, his radio erupted with a cacophony of voices. Dozens, or maybe hundreds of them, all talking at once, all reporting accidents and injuries and calling for help that never came. The voices overlapped and interfered with each other, creating a wall of sound that was almost painful to listen to. Through the chaos, Amos could make out fragments. Multiple vehicle pileup, need ambulances, been waiting for hours. Where are the responders? Why won't anyone answer? We're dying out here, please help. Someone please help. The noise cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt like pressure against his eardrums. Amos looked at Lyle, who was pale despite the cold. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Willa's voice came back immediately, sounding shaken. "Go ahead, Sheriff. Are you still receiving 911 calls from this location?" "Negative. The last call came in about 5 minutes ago. Since then, nothing." Amos looked at the telephone pole, at the disconnected wire, at the impossible box that couldn't possibly be transmitting anything. "Copy that. We're going to do a wider search of the area and then head back to town." They spent the next hour driving the service roads that crisscross the wind farm, checking every pull-off and access point for any sign of a vehicle or accident. They found nothing. The wind farm was empty except for the turbines themselves, turning steadily in the wind that had picked up again, their red lights blinking in sequence like some kind of warning system for a threat that couldn't be named. As they prepared to leave, Amos took one last look at the telephone pole at mile marker 7. In the darkness between the turbine lights, he could almost convince himself that he saw something. Shapes that might have been people standing near the pole, waiting for help that would never come. But when he turned his spotlight on the area, there was nothing there except the pole and the coiled wire and the wind moving through the grass. The next morning, Amos drove to the county records office and pulled the files on the wind farm development. The project had been controversial from the start, with significant opposition from local ranchers who objected to the industrial development of what had been open range for over a century. The development company had pushed through anyway, citing economic benefits and renewable energy mandates. Construction had begun in spring of 2015 and had proceeded on an aggressive schedule, with the first turbines going operational that fall. What Amos found in the construction reports made him pause. There had been an accident during construction, a multiple vehicle collision on the service road that had killed 4 workers and injured 6 others. The accident had occurred at night when a supply truck had missed a turn in the unfamiliar road system and collided with a crew van that was returning from a late shift. The impact had been severe enough that both vehicles had caught fire, and the response had been delayed because the accident occurred right at the county line, causing confusion about which jurisdiction should respond. According to the incident report, filed by the previous sheriff who had retired 2 years before Amos took over, the first 911 call had come in at 11:47 p.m., from a construction worker who had used the emergency landline that had been installed at mile marker 7 specifically for worker safety during the construction phase. Multiple calls had followed over the next 3 hours, increasingly desperate as the injured workers waited for help that was delayed by jurisdictional confusion, poor weather, and the remote location. By the time the first responders arrived, 3 of the 4 fatalities had already occurred. The 4th worker had died en route to the hospital. Amos sat in the records room for a long time, staring at the accident report and the timeline of the 911 calls. The last call had been logged at 2:43 a.m., made by a worker who was trapped in the burning crew van and couldn't get out. The transcript of the call was painful to read. The worker had been calm at first, describing his location and his injuries, assuring the dispatcher that help was on the way. As the minutes stretched into hours and the fire spread, the calls had become more desperate, more confused, asking why no one was coming, why they'd been forgotten, begging for someone to please just send help. The telephone line at mile marker 7 had been disconnected 6 months after the accident, when the construction phase ended and the wind farm became operational. The emergency landline was no longer needed, and the phone company had removed it as part of their upgrade to the new system. But according to the 911 system, calls were still coming from that location, from a phone that no longer existed, making reports that matched exactly the pattern of the accident that had occurred 5 years ago. Amos returned to the wind farm that night, this time with a different purpose. He parked at mile marker 7 and sat in his vehicle with the engine off, watching the turbines turn and waiting to see if the impossible would happen again. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 5 years to the minute from the first call during the construction accident, his radio crackled to life. The voice was clear this time, distorted but understandable, and Amos recognized the calm professionalism of someone trained to report emergencies accurately despite their own fear. 911, this is construction worker Marcus Chen. We've had a multiple vehicle accident on the service road near mile marker 7. We need ambulances immediately. There are multiple injuries, at least 2 critical. Please hurry. Amos keyed his mic, knowing it was pointless but unable to stop himself. Marcus, this is Sheriff Reddick. Help is on the way. Hold on. The response came after a pause, and this time the voice sounded puzzled, hopeful. Sheriff, someone's finally responding? We've been calling for hours. Where are the ambulances? They're coming, Marcus. They're on their way right now. Just hold on. Thank you. Thank you so much. We were starting to think no one was coming. Tell the others help is on the way. They're scared. There was a click, and the connection went dead. Amos sat in his vehicle, staring at the telephone pole that couldn't possibly be transmitting anything, and felt the weight of something he couldn't name settle over him. The turbines continued to turn, their red lights blinking in sequence, marking time in a way that seemed to have nothing to do with forward progression, and everything to do with endless repetition. Over the following months, the calls continued. Always at night, always from the same location, always reporting the same accident with the same injuries, and the same desperate need for help that never arrived in time. Amos responded to each call, driving out to mile marker 7 and sitting with his radio, talking to voices that shouldn't exist, providing comfort to people who had died 5 years ago but somehow didn't know it yet. He never told anyone else in the department about what he was doing, never explained why he spent so many nights parked at the wind farm, talking to ghosts through a radio system that shouldn't be able to receive their calls. The wind farm company eventually complained about his frequent presence on their service roads, suggesting that he was harassing their operation or looking for reasons to shut them down. Amos ignored the complaints and continued his vigil, night after night, responding to calls that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, talking to people who were trapped in the worst night of their lives and didn't understand why help never came when they needed it most. He started keeping a log of the calls, documenting each one with the same careful attention he gave to any other incident report. The calls followed a pattern that matched the original accident reports exactly, starting with the first calm notification and gradually escalating into desperation as hours passed and no help arrived. The voices cycled through the same questions, the same pleas, the same confusion about why they'd been abandoned. Sometimes Amos could hear background sounds that made his chest tight, the sound of fire crackling, people crying, someone screaming in pain that couldn't be managed, and always, underneath it all, the low-frequency hum of the turbines creating a rhythm that seemed to trap time in an endless loop. One night in early spring, 6 months after the calls had started, Amos sat at mile marker 7 during the usual window when the voices came through. But this time something was different. The call came through at the expected time, but the voice on the other end was new. It was a woman, young, speaking with the careful professionalism of a 911 dispatcher. "This is Harlan County Emergency Services. We have units responding to your location. Can you confirm you're still at mile marker 7 on the Wind Farm Service Road?" Amos keyed his mic, his heart pounding. "This is Sheriff Reddick. Who is this? I'm Dispatcher Willa Kerr. Sheriff, are you at the scene of the accident? We've had multiple calls reporting a collision with injuries." Amos realized what he was hearing. Somehow, the loop had expanded, incorporating not just the victim's calls, but the dispatch response, creating a complete circuit of communication that had no beginning and no end. He was listening to what should have happened 5 years ago, the response that had been delayed by confusion and bad weather and bureaucratic complications until it came too late. Marcus Chen's voice came back, filled with relief so profound it was painful to hear. "Thank God. We thought you'd forgotten about us. How long until the ambulances arrive?" "They're on their way now. Should be there within 20 minutes. Marcus, I need you to stay on the line with me. Can you do that?" Yes, I can stay on the line. Tell me what you see." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, exactly the kind of reassurance someone in crisis needed to hear. "I'm in the crew van. The truck hit us on the driver's side. The van rolled and now it's on its side. I can smell gasoline and something's wrong with the electrical system. There are sparks." "Okay, Marcus, I need you to try to get everyone out of the vehicle if you can. Move away from the van and wait for the responders." "We can't. The doors are jammed and Tom is pinned under the dashboard. If we move him, he'll bleed out. We need the paramedics to extract him properly." The conversation continued, the dispatcher talking Marcus through the impossible situation with calm competence, while Amos sat in his vehicle and listened to a response that was 5 years too late play out over his radio. He wanted to interrupt, to tell them it was pointless, that this had already happened and ended in tragedy, but he couldn't make himself break the circuit, couldn't bring himself to destroy whatever small comfort these voices found in finally receiving the help they'd begged for. The dispatcher stayed on the line for the next 20 minutes, talking to Marcus, getting updates on the injured, providing medical instructions for managing trauma until the ambulances arrived. And then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the same time the real responders had arrived 5 years ago, the dispatcher said the words that marked the end of the loop. "Marcus, the ambulances are on scene. You're going to be okay. Help has arrived." There was a long pause, and then Marcus's voice came through one last time, so quiet Amos had to strain to hear it. "Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting about us." The radio went silent. No static, no voices, no background sound of turbines or wind. Just silence that felt like a door closing on something that had been left open too long. Amos never received another call from mile marker 7. The 911 system stopped showing impossible calls from the disconnected landline, and the radio frequency that had carried the voices of the dead went quiet. He continued to visit the site occasionally, parking at the telephone pole, and sitting in the darkness between the turbines, listening to nothing but the wind and the rhythmic sound of the blades cutting through air. Sometimes he wondered if he'd provided some kind of closure, if by responding to the calls and talking to the voices, he'd given them what they'd needed to finally let go. Or maybe the loop had simply run its course, playing out the same scenario over and over until it had exhausted whatever energy sustained it. The telephone pole still stands at mile marker 7, marked with faded orange tape and scheduled for removal that never quite happens. The wind turbines continue to turn, their red lights blinking in sequence through the night, marking time in a way that suggests nothing ever really ends, that some moments stretch out infinitely, replaying themselves for anyone who knows how to listen. Amos retired from the sheriff's office 2 years ago, but he still drives out to the wind farm sometimes, usually late at night when the county is quiet and the turbines are the only movement on the landscape. He sits at mile marker 7 with his radio on, not expecting to hear anything but listening anyway, just in case someone out there still needs to know that help is on the way, that they haven't been forgotten, that someone is finally responding to their call. Sheriff Calder Boone was halfway through his third cup of coffee when the call came in from the grain elevator on the east side of town, and his first thought was that it was probably teenagers again, breaking into abandoned buildings for whatever thrill came from trespassing in places where the dust was thick enough to choke on, and the floors were rotted through in spots that could drop you 3 stories into darkness if you weren't careful. It was 6:35 on a Saturday morning in mid-February, cold enough that the windows of his office in the county courthouse were frosted over in patterns that looked like ferns, and the light coming through them had that pale quality that came with winter mornings when the sun was up but hadn't yet managed to warm anything. Redmond County sat in the agricultural heart of Kansas, where wheat fields stretched in every direction, and the towns that served them had been built around grain elevators and railroad lines that connected the harvest to markets hundreds of miles away. The county covered 800 square miles with a population of about 12,000, most of them living in the county seat of Ashland, or in one of the smaller communities that dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in a story about farming and weather and the slow decline of rural America. Calder had been sheriff here for 7 years, and before that he'd spent 5 years as a deputy and 3 years with the state police, working highway patrol on the interstate that cut through the eastern part of the county and connected Kansas City to Denver through 1,000 miles of landscape that looked the same mile after mile. The grain elevator that dominated Ashland's eastern skyline had been built in 1947, a massive concrete structure that rose 10 stories above the prairie and could be seen from 20 miles away on a clear day. It had been the economic center of the county for decades, processing wheat from hundreds of farms and shipping it out on trains that ran day and night during harvest season. But the elevator had been closed for almost 15 years now, shut down when the agricultural economics changed, and the smaller operations couldn't compete with the massive facilities that could process grain more cheaply in centralized locations. The building had sat empty since then, slowly deteriorating, with broken windows and rust staining the concrete and warning signs posted around the perimeter that did nothing to stop the occasional trespasser from climbing the fence and exploring the abandoned structure. Ashland County Sheriff's Office, this is Sheriff Boone. The voice on the other end was familiar, belonging to Tansy LeClaire, who'd worked at the grain elevator for 20 years before it closed, and now lived in a small house about a quarter mile from the facility, close enough that she could see it from her kitchen window. Sheriff Boone, this is Tansy LeClaire. I'm sorry to call so early, but something strange is happening at the elevator. The motion sensor lights have been going on and off all night, like someone's walking around inside. That wasn't particularly unusual. The elevator still had its old security system, including motion sensor lights that were supposed to deter trespassers, though they ran on backup power that was unreliable and often triggered by birds or wind-blown debris. What makes you think it's not just the system acting up? Tansy sounded uncertain. I can't really explain it, Sheriff. The lights are activating in a pattern, like someone's moving through the building floor by floor. I've been watching it for the past 3 hours, and it's the same pattern over and over. Someone goes up the stairs, walks across each level, then goes back down. It's too regular to be random. Calder grabbed his jacket and keys, already mentally preparing for what would probably be a routine trespassing call. I'll head over there now, Tansy. You stay inside and lock your doors. If you see anyone leaving the building, call me immediately. He radioed Deputy Jessup Morrow, who was on patrol on the north side of town, and asked him to meet at the grain elevator for backup. Jessup was relatively new to the department, transferred up from Wichita about a year ago, looking for the slower pace of rural law enforcement. But he was thorough and didn't mind the odd hours that came with being one of only 3 deputies in a county that covered a lot of ground with very few people. The drive to the elevator took Calder through the quiet streets of Ashland, past houses where people were just starting to wake up, lights appearing in windows as coffee makers were started and morning routines began. The town had maybe 3,000 people, most of them connected to farming in one way or another, and it had the neat, modest appearance of a community that took pride in maintaining what it had even as economic forces pulled population and resources toward larger cities. The grain elevator dominated the eastern edge of town, rising above the single-story buildings and houses like a monument to an industry that had built the county and then moved on when the economics no longer supported small-town operations. Calder parked at the chain-link fence that surrounded the elevator complex and waited for Jessup to arrive. The motion sensor lights that Tansy had mentioned were clearly visible, mounted at intervals up the side of the main tower, and as he watched, they activated in sequence starting from the ground level and moving upward, each light staying on for about 30 seconds before darkening again as the next level lit up. The pattern was exactly as Tansy had described, methodical and regular, like someone was climbing the interior stairs and triggering each sensor as they passed. When all the lights had activated and darkened in sequence, there was a pause of about 2 minutes, and then the pattern repeated, starting again from the ground level and moving upward through the building. Jessup pulled up a few minutes later and got out of his patrol unit, his breath fogging in the cold air as he walked over to where Calder was standing. "Sheriff, what are we looking at?" Calder pointed to the lights, motion sensors activating in sequence. Been going on for hours according to Tansy LeClaire. Could be a malfunction in the system, could be someone inside triggering them. Jessup watched as the lights began their sequence again. Ground floor to top floor, methodical and precise. That's a pretty specific malfunction. They approached the main gate, which was secured with a heavy chain and padlock that showed no signs of tampering. The fence itself was 8 feet of chain link topped with 3 strands of barbed wire, and a quick walk around the perimeter showed no obvious points of entry, no cut sections or places where someone could have climbed over without significant effort and probable injury. The security of the perimeter suggested that if someone was inside, they'd been there for a while, possibly since before the facility was locked down. The main entrance to the elevator complex was a heavy steel door that had been welded shut years ago, but there was a smaller personnel door on the north side that Calder knew had been left accessible for occasional inspections by county officials and insurance adjusters who needed to document the building's condition. The door was locked with a padlock that Calder had a key for, kept in the sheriff's office for exactly these situations. He unlocked it and pushed the door open, immediately hit by the smell of old grain dust and concrete, a combination that was distinctive and slightly sweet, mixed with the metallic tang of rust and the musty scent of abandonment. Inside, the ground floor of the elevator opened into a vast space that had once held the machinery for processing grain, now mostly stripped out except for some large equipment that had been too expensive or difficult to remove. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained, covered with a layer of dust thick enough that any footprints would show clearly. Calder shined his flashlight across the floor and found what he expected. No footprints. No sign that anyone had walked through here recently. The dust was undisturbed except for the tracks of small animals and the scattered debris of birds that nested in the high spaces near the broken windows. He keyed his radio. "Tansy, this is Sheriff Boone. I'm inside the building. Can you see if the lights are still activating in the same pattern?" There was a pause, and then Tansy's voice came back. "Yes, Sheriff. They just started again. Ground floor to top floor. Same as before." Calder looked around the ground floor space, trying to locate the motion sensor that would trigger the exterior light. He found it mounted near the entrance, a standard commercial sensor that should activate when something moved within its detection range. He walked directly in front of it, and the exterior light came on immediately, confirming that the system was functioning. But there was nothing else moving on the ground floor. Nothing that could explain why the sensor kept activating in regular intervals. "We're going to check the upper floors," Calder said to Jessup. "Stay alert and watch for any signs that someone's been here recently." The interior stairs were steel, bolted to the concrete walls and rising through the center of the structure in a pattern that connected all 10 floors. Calder and Jessup climbed slowly, checking each level as they passed. The floors were similar to the ground level, large open spaces that had once held grain or machinery, now empty except for dust and debris. On the 3rd floor, Jessup stopped and pointed to something with his flashlight. "Sheriff, look at this." The motion sensor on this level was mounted on the wall about 8 feet up, positioned to cover the entire floor space. Directly below it, the dust on the floor was undisturbed, showing no footprints or signs of passage. But as they watched, the sensor activated, triggering the exterior light that was visible through the broken windows. The sensor stayed active for 30 seconds, following its programmed sequence, and then deactivated. "That shouldn't be happening," Jessup said. "There's nothing moving in its detection range." They continued upward, checking each floor and finding the same pattern. The motion sensors were activating in sequence, triggering the exterior lights exactly as Tansy had described, but there was nothing on any of the floors that could explain why. The dust was undisturbed, the spaces were empty, and the sensors themselves appeared to be functioning normally, detecting movement when Calder and Jessup walked in front of them, but also activating on their own in the regular pattern that had been repeating for hours. On the 8th floor, Calder heard something that made him stop. Footsteps, distant but distinct, coming from somewhere above them. Not the heavy boot sounds of law enforcement or the irregular pattern of teenagers trying to move quietly, but steady footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, moving across the floor overhead with a rhythm that suggested someone who knew where they were going and had no reason to hide their presence. He signaled Jessup to be quiet and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for perhaps 20 seconds, moved from one side of the floor above them to the other, and then stopped. There was a pause, and then the sound of a door opening and closing, metal scraping against metal in a way that echoed through the empty structure. They climbed quickly to the 9th floor, weapons drawn, moving carefully through the doorway and scanning the space with their flashlights. The floor was empty, dust undisturbed, no sign that anyone had been there. But Calder could still hear footsteps, now coming from the floor above them, the 10th and final level of the elevator tower. The sound was clearer now, distinct enough that he could make out individual steps, someone walking in a steady pattern across the floor, pausing occasionally as if looking at something, then continuing. "Sheriff's Department," Calder called out. "If anyone is up there, I need you to identify yourself and come down the stairs with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped. There was a long silence, and then they started again. Same pattern, same deliberate pace, moving across the floor overhead as if his announcement hadn't been heard or didn't matter. Calder and Jessup climbed to the 10th floor, moving quickly now, expecting to find whoever was making the sounds and end this strange situation with a trespassing citation and an escort off the property. They emerged onto the top floor and found it completely empty. The space was smaller than the lower floors, more of an observation level and equipment room than a grain storage area, with windows on all sides that provided views across the county in every direction. The dust on the floor was thick and completely undisturbed. There were no footprints, no signs of any presence, no indication that anyone had been on this level in months or possibly years. But the footsteps continued. They were clear and unmistakable, coming from directly in front of Calder, moving across the empty floor toward the windows on the east side. He could hear each individual step, the slight echo that came with walking on concrete, the rhythm of someone walking with purpose. He raised his flashlight and tracked the sound, expecting to see something even though logic said there was nothing there to see. The motion sensor on the 10th floor activated, responding to something moving through its detection range, and the exterior light came on, flooding the space with harsh illumination that showed every corner, every surface, every inch of the empty floor. There was nothing there. The footsteps reached the east windows and stopped. Calder could hear what sounded like someone shifting their weight, the small sounds of a person standing still but not completely motionless, breathing or adjusting their posture. The motion sensor stayed active, tracking movement that neither Calder nor Jessup could see. And then the footsteps started again, moving back across the floor toward the stairs, passing within a few feet of where Calder was standing. He felt something as they passed, a cold spot in the air, a sensation of presence that made the hair on his arms stand up, and for just a moment he could have sworn he heard breathing, steady and calm. The sound of someone comfortable in this space and unbothered by the presence of law enforcement. The footsteps descended the stairs, and Calder and Jessup followed, tracking the sound as it moved down through the building, floor by floor, triggering motion sensors as it passed, but leaving no other evidence of passage. They reached the ground floor and watched as the footsteps moved across the space toward the north door where they'd entered. The motion sensor activated, the exterior light came on, and the footsteps stopped at the door. There was the sound of metal scraping metal, exactly as Calder had heard on the 9th floor, and then the footsteps started again, moving back into the building and beginning the climb up the stairs, heading toward the top floor to repeat the pattern. Calder and Jessup stood on the ground floor, listening to the footsteps fade as they climbed, and looked at each other in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Neither spoke for a long moment, and then Jessup broke the silence. "Sheriff, what the hell is happening here?" Calder didn't have an answer. He'd been in law enforcement for 15 years and had dealt with everything from domestic violence to armed robbery to people having psychotic breaks in public places. But he'd never encountered anything like this. Sounds that suggested presence where there was none. Motion sensors detecting movement that couldn't be seen. Footsteps echoing through an empty building with the steady rhythm of someone who had somewhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. They spent the next hour conducting a thorough search of the entire facility, checking every floor, every room, every space large enough to hide a person. They found nothing except dust and decay and the evidence of birds that nested in the high spaces where humans rarely went. The motion sensors continued to activate in their regular pattern, tracking something that moved through the building on a schedule that never varied, and the footsteps continued, audible but disconnected from any physical presence that could explain them. Calder took photographs, documented everything in his incident report, and finally locked up the building and returned to his patrol unit, frustrated and unsettled in equal measure. He drove back to Tansy LeClaire's house and knocked on her door. She answered immediately, looking relieved to see him. "Did you find who was in there?" Calder chose his words carefully. We searched the entire building. There's no one inside and no signs of forced entry. The motion sensors are definitely activating, but I can't explain why. Maybe it's some kind of electrical malfunction or environmental factor triggering the sensors. Tansy looked past him toward the grain elevator, her expression troubled. Sheriff, I worked in that building for 20 years. I know every floor, every room, every sound it makes. What's happening now is different from anything I heard when the elevator was operational. Someone is in there, walking the same route they used to walk when they worked there. I can't explain it, but I know what I'm hearing. Who worked that route, Tansy? Who walked through the building like that? She was quiet for a moment, her eyes still fixed on the elevator. Ephraim Goodwine. He was the night janitor for 15 years. Started at the bottom floor every night at sunset and worked his way up, cleaning each level before moving to the next. Finished at the top floor around midnight, then locked up and went home. Same routine every night, 5 nights a week, for 15 years. Calder felt something cold settle in his chest. When did Ephraim stop working there? Tansy turned to look at him, and he could see tears in her eyes. He didn't stop, Sheriff. Ephraim was cleaning the 7th floor when the elevator shut down. They told him on a Friday afternoon that his services were no longer needed, that the building was closing and he should collect his final paycheck from the office. He worked his shift that night anyway, said he needed to finish cleaning the building properly before it closed. No one saw him again after that. What happened to him? Tansy looked back at the elevator. They found his body in the stairwell between the 8th and 9th floors 3 weeks later. The building was already locked up by then, and no one had reason to go inside. Medical examiner said it was a heart attack. Ephraim was 68 years old, overweight, had high blood pressure. He probably felt chest pains while he was cleaning and tried to get down the stairs for help, but didn't make it. Calder looked at the elevator, watching the motion sensor lights activate in their regular pattern, ground floor to top floor, methodical and precise. The same route Ephraim Goodwine had walked 5 nights a week for 15 years until his heart gave out on a stairwell in a building that was already dead. Cleaning spaces that would never be used again because it was the only routine he knew and the only purpose he had left. How long ago did this happen? Tansy wiped her eyes. 15 years next month. The elevator closed in February 2010, and they found Ephraim's body in March. The building's been empty ever since. Calder drove back to his office and spent the rest of the morning reviewing old case files from 2010. He found the report on Ephraim Goodwine's death, filed by the sheriff who'd held the office before Calder's predecessor, a thorough investigation that concluded exactly what Tansy had described. Heart attack, no suspicious circumstances, body found after several weeks of decomposition, determined to have died while the building was in the transition period between operational and fully closed. The report noted that Goodwine had no immediate family, no close friends, and had spent most of his adult life working maintenance and janitorial jobs that kept him employed but never really noticed. That night, Calder returned to the grain elevator, this time alone. He wanted to observe the phenomenon without the distraction of having another deputy present. Wanted to see if the sounds and the motion sensor activations continued when there was no one else to witness them. He parked outside the fence and sat in his patrol unit, watching the building and waiting. At exactly 6:35 p.m., the same time Tansy had called that morning, the motion sensors began their sequence. Ground floor light activated. Stayed on for 30 seconds, then darkened. First floor light activated, same timing. The pattern continued up through all 10 floors, taking about 6 minutes to complete the full sequence, and then paused for 2 minutes before starting again. Calder unlocked the north door and entered the building, moving quietly to the ground floor and positioning himself where he could observe without interfering. The interior was dark except for the faint light coming through the broken windows. and the temperature had dropped enough that he could see his breath. He stood perfectly still and waited, and exactly on schedule, he heard the footsteps. They started at the north door, the same door he'd just used to enter, and moved across the ground floor with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who'd walked this route thousands of times. The motion sensor on the ground floor activated, detecting something that Calder couldn't see, and the exterior light came on, illuminating the space in harsh detail that showed nothing but empty floor and undisturbed dust. The footsteps reached the base of the stairs and began to climb. Calder followed, staying several floors below, tracking the sound as it moved upward through the building. On each floor, the footsteps paused for exactly the same amount of time, 30 seconds, before continuing to the next level. The pattern was precise, mechanical almost, the routine of someone who'd done this job so many times that it had become automatic, requiring no thought or variation. Calder reached the 8th floor and stopped, listening as the footsteps above him completed their circuit of the 9th floor and then started toward the stairs that led to the 10th floor. This was where Ephraim Goodwin had died, somewhere between these stairs, collapsing with chest pains that became a heart attack, dying alone in a building that was already shutting down, his routine interrupted by the only thing that could stop it. The footsteps climbed past where Calder stood and continued to the 10th floor. He heard them move across the space above him, pausing at regular intervals, completing the circuit of the observation level, and then returning to the stairs. They descended, passing the 9th floor, passing the 8th floor where Calder stood, and then stopping. The footsteps stopped exactly where he was standing, and Calder felt the temperature drop suddenly, cold enough that his breath became visible even in the dim interior. He could hear breathing now, labored and strained, the sound of someone in distress. The sound lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, ragged breathing mixed with a quiet groaning that spoke of pain that couldn't be managed, and then it stopped. The footsteps resumed, continuing down the stairs at a slower pace, reaching the ground floor and moving toward the north door. The sound of metal scraping metal echoed through the space, and then the footsteps started again, beginning the climb back up to the 10th floor. Calder stood on the 8th floor stairwell, exactly where Ephraim Goodwin had died 15 years ago, and understood what he was witnessing. Not a haunting in the traditional sense, not some supernatural entity trying to communicate or seeking resolution, but a routine that had been interrupted by death and somehow continued anyway, playing out night after night with the mechanical precision of someone who'd never learned how to stop working, who'd defined their existence through the rhythm of floors cleaned and duties completed, who'd died trying to finish the job and couldn't accept that the job was already over. He returned to his patrol unit and sat watching the building as the motion sensor lights continued their sequence, marking the progress of footsteps that echoed through empty spaces, tracking the movement of someone who'd been dead for 15 years but hadn't yet finished their shift. Calder picked up his radio and called Tansy LeClaire. "Tansy, this is Sheriff Boone. I need to ask you something about Ephraim Goodwin. What kind of worker was he?" There was a pause. "He was the most reliable person I ever worked with, Sheriff. Came in exactly on time every night. Never called in sick, never complained, never cut corners. He took pride in keeping that building clean, said it was the only thing he'd ever been really good at. Toward the end, when we all knew the elevator was closing, people started getting sloppy, showing up late or not at all. But not Ephraim. He worked every shift like it mattered, cleaned every floor like someone was going to inspect it in the morning. Did he know the building was closing? Oh, he knew. We all knew. But Ephraim said he was going to finish his job properly, wasn't going to let them shut down a dirty facility. He took it personal, like it was his responsibility to send the building off right." Calder thanked Tansy and ended the call. He sat in his patrol unit for another hour, watching the motion sensor lights trace their pattern up and down the building, marking the progress of a routine that death hadn't been able to interrupt. The pattern never varied, never deviated, never stopped. Ephraim Goodwin was still cleaning the elevator, still walking his route with the same dedication he'd shown for 15 years, still trying to finish a job that would never be complete because the building he'd taken such pride in keeping clean was never going to open again. Over the following weeks, Calder made regular checks on the grain elevator, documenting the phenomenon in his incident reports but never quite knowing how to classify what he was observing. The footsteps continued nightly, starting at 6:35 p.m. and running until approximately midnight, the same hours Ephraim had worked when the elevator was operational. The motion sensors tracked the invisible progress through the building, and anyone who stood quietly inside could hear the footsteps, the breathing, the small sounds of someone moving through familiar spaces with practiced efficiency. Word spread through Ashland about the situation, and some people started calling the elevator haunted, avoiding the area after dark and telling stories about the ghost of the janitor who couldn't stop working even after he died. Calder discouraged the ghost talk, not because he didn't believe something unexplainable was happening, but because reducing it to ghost stories felt disrespectful to Ephraim Goodwin, who'd spent 15 years taking pride in a job that most people considered menial and had died trying to finish what he'd started. The county decided to demolish the grain elevator in the summer of 2026, citing safety concerns and the cost of maintaining insurance on an abandoned structure. Calder was there on the last night before the demolition crew arrived, sitting in his patrol unit and watching the motion sensor lights activate in their familiar pattern, marking the progress of someone who'd never stopped working, who'd never accepted that their routine was over, who'd died trying to finish one last shift. The lights activated for the final time just before midnight, completing their circuit from ground floor to top floor, and then the building went dark. The demolition took 3 days, heavy equipment reducing the massive structure to rubble that was hauled away to be recycled or buried. The site was cleared and leveled, leaving nothing but a flat expanse of concrete foundation that was eventually covered with gravel and turned into a parking lot for the farmers market that operated on weekends. But Tansy LeClaire still calls the sheriff's office occasionally, usually late at night, to report that she can hear footsteps near where the elevator used to stand, someone walking the same route they'd walked for 15 years, still trying to finish cleaning a building that no longer exists, still taking pride in a job that will never be complete because completion would mean the work was over, and the work was all Ephraim Goodwin knew how to be. The first snowflakes were just starting to fall when Sheriff Hiram Doss pulled into the truck stop on the south side of Colville, the kind of heavy, wet snow that came down in early March and turned road conditions from manageable to dangerous in the span of an hour. It was 9:43 on a Tuesday night, cold enough that the parking lot was nearly empty except for a handful of long-haul rigs idling in the designated truck parking area, their exhaust creating columns of white vapor that rose into the darkness and merged with the falling snow. Hiram had stopped for coffee and a chance to finish the incident report he'd been working on since responding to a domestic disturbance call 3 hours earlier, a situation that had required more diplomacy than law enforcement and had left him drained in the particular way that came from talking people down from confrontations they'd been building toward for months or years. Morgan County sat in the northeastern corner of Montana, where the high plains met the Badlands in a landscape of rolling hills cut by dry creek beds and punctuated by rock formations that rose like monuments to geological time. The county covered 1,800 square miles with a population of about 5,000, most of them living in the county seat of Colville, or scattered across ranches that measured their property in sections rather than acres. Route 19 was the main artery through the county, a 2-lane highway that connected Colville to the interstate 40 miles south and served as the primary route for commercial traffic moving through the region. It was a good road by rural Montana standards, well-maintained and relatively straight, but it was also isolated enough that help could be a long time coming if something went wrong, especially on a night like this when the snow was starting to fall and visibility was dropping with every minute that passed. Hiram had been sheriff of Morgan County for 11 years, and before that he'd spent 8 years as a deputy, working his way through the ranks in a department that consisted of himself, 4 deputies, and a dispatch system that covered the county from a small office in the courthouse basement. He knew Route 19 as well as anyone, had driven it thousands of times in all weather and all seasons, had worked accidents on it ranging from minor fender benders to multi-vehicle pileups that closed the highway for hours. The road had a rhythm to it, a pattern of traffic that varied with the time of day and the season, but remained generally predictable. Late-night commercial traffic, early morning commuters heading to jobs in the larger towns to the south, afternoon traffic that picked up during harvest season when grain trucks were running constantly between fields and elevators. He was halfway through his coffee when his radio crackled with the distinctive squelch that preceded a transmission on the emergency channel. "Unit 1, this is dispatch." Hiram keyed his mic. "Go ahead. We're getting a distress call on CB Channel 9. Trucker reporting mechanical trouble on Route 19 northbound, approximately mile marker 32. Caller identified as Maeve Hollis, driving a blue Peterbilt hauling refrigerated freight. She's requesting assistance with what sounds like a breakdown situation." Hiram set down his coffee and started his patrol unit. "Copy that. I'm at the truck stop in Colville, about 15 minutes from that location. Can you get Deputy Pritchard to respond as backup?" Dispatch came back immediately. "Negative. Deputy Pritchard is handling a situation in the North County. You're the closest unit. Caller says she's in a safe location off the highway, hazard lights activated. She's been trying to reach a tow service but hasn't been able to get through." Hiram pulled out of the truck stop and headed south on Route 19, his windshield wipers working steadily to clear the accumulating snow. The highway was nearly empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of night in early March, when most of the commercial traffic had already made its runs, and the locals knew better than to be out driving in deteriorating weather conditions. Mile marker 32 was in a section of Route 19 that ran through open rangeland. No buildings or turnoffs for several miles in either direction, the kind of isolated stretch where a breakdown could leave you stranded for a long time if you weren't prepared for it. As he drove, Hiram switched his radio to CB Channel 9, the emergency frequency that truckers use to communicate about road conditions and request assistance. The channel should have been relatively quiet at this time of night, but instead he heard a voice, female, distressed but controlled, speaking with the kind of professional calm that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. "This is Unit Charlie, November 650, Blue Peterbilt hauling refrigerated freight northbound on Route 19. I've got mechanical failure at approximately mile marker 32. Engine overheating, losing power. I've pulled off onto the shoulder and activated hazards. Requesting assistance from any available units. Temperature is dropping fast and I've got perishable cargo that's at risk." Hiram keyed his mic on the CB frequency. "Unit Charlie November 650, this is Morgan County Sheriff. I'm responding to your location, approximately 12 minutes out. Can you confirm your exact position and the nature of your mechanical problem?" There was a pause, and then the voice came back, sounding relieved. "Sheriff, thank you for responding. I'm on the northbound shoulder of Route 19, mile marker 32. My engine's been running hot for the past 20 miles, and now it's overheated to the point where I've lost power steering and the temperature gauge is redlining. I think it's a coolant leak, but I can't safely check it until the engine cools down. I've got a full load of frozen food products that need to stay refrigerated, but my auxiliary power is failing. Copy that. Stay in your vehicle with the doors locked until I arrive. I've got a tow operator on standby who can assist with the mechanical issues. How's your heating situation? The voice responded immediately. Heating's working for now, but if I lose power completely, I'll be running on battery only. I've got emergency supplies, so I'm not in immediate danger, but this weather's getting worse fast. Hiram acknowledged the transmission and continued south, his headlights cutting through the falling snow and illuminating a road that was starting to accumulate a thin layer of white that made the pavement treacherous. He passed mile marker 35, then 34, then 33, scanning the roadside for any sign of the disabled truck. At mile marker 32, he slowed to a crawl and swept his spotlight across both shoulders of the highway. There was nothing there. No blue Peterbilt, no hazard lights, no sign that any vehicle had pulled off the road recently. The snow was falling heavily enough now that it would have covered any tire tracks within minutes, but there should still be some indication of a large truck parked on the shoulder, some disturbance in the accumulating snow or reflection from hazard lights or the dark shape of a trailer against the white landscape. Hiram keyed his CB radio. Unit Charlie November 650, this is Sheriff Doss. I'm at mile marker 32, but I don't see your vehicle. Can you confirm your location? There was no response. He tried again, using both the CB frequency and his patrol radio to contact dispatch. Dispatch, this is Unit 1. I'm at mile marker 32 on Route 19 northbound. No sign of the disabled truck. Can you confirm the caller's location? Dispatch came back sounding puzzled. Sheriff, I'm showing the last transmission from that CB unit as originating from mile marker 32, but I'm not getting any current signal. The channel's gone quiet. Hiram drove slowly along Route 19 for the next 5 miles, checking both shoulders and all the pull-offs and access roads that intersected the highway. He found nothing. The snow continued to fall, and the temperature continued to drop, and the highway remained empty except for his patrol unit moving through the accumulating white. He was about to turn around and head back north when his CB radio crackled to life again. The same female voice, the same controlled urgency. This is Unit Charlie November 650 requesting immediate assistance. My situation has deteriorated. Engine is completely dead now. No power, no heat. Outside temperature is dropping below 0 and I'm starting to lose feeling in my extremities. I need help now. Any available units, please respond. Hiram keyed his mic immediately. Unit Charlie November 650. This is Sheriff Doss. I'm on Route 19 actively searching for your location. I need you to give me more specific information. What landmarks can you see? Are there any mile markers visible? What direction were you traveling when you broke down? The response came after a pause. Sheriff, I'm northbound on Route 19, approximately mile marker 32. I can see the highway stretching in both directions, but there's no traffic. The snow's coming down so heavy I can barely see beyond my hood. I pulled off onto the shoulder when my engine died, tried to get as far from the travel lane as possible. My hazards are still working, but the battery's getting low. Please, I need help. My cargo's completely thawed now and I'm getting hypothermic. Hiram felt frustration building. He was at mile marker 32, exactly where the caller said she was, but there was no truck, no lights, no indication that anyone was there. He keyed his radio again, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. Unit Charlie, November 650. I need you to try something for me. Can you flash your high beams 3 times? That will help me locate you in this weather. He watched the highway in both directions, waiting for any sign of headlights flashing in the pattern he'd requested. Nothing. The highway remained dark except for his own lights and the steady fall of snow that was beginning to create drifts along the shoulder. His CB radio crackled again, but this time the voice sounded different. Still female, but distorted somehow. Words stretching and compressing like an audio recording played at incorrect speed. Sheriff, I don't understand why you can't see me. I'm right here. I can see your lights. You're driving right past me. Please stop. Please help. I'm so cold." Hiram stopped his patrol unit in the middle of the highway and got out, standing in the falling snow with his flashlight scanning the landscape in all directions. The visibility was down to maybe 100 feet, the snow creating a white curtain that obscured everything beyond the immediate area around his vehicle. He called out, voice carrying across the empty landscape. "Maeve Hollis, if you can hear me, make some noise. Flash your lights, honk your horn, anything to help me find you." His words were swallowed by the wind and snow, and there was no response except the steady hiss of precipitation hitting his jacket and the lonely sound of wind moving across open land. He got back in his patrol unit and contacted dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. I need you to run the CB call sign Charlie November 650 through the commercial vehicle database. I need to know who this truck is registered to and if there are any recent reports of this unit in the area." "Hold on, Sheriff." Hiram waited, engine idling, watching the snow accumulate on his windshield between swipes of the wipers. The landscape was becoming featureless, distinction between road and shoulder and field disappearing under the uniform white of the storm. His CB radio remained quiet now. The distress calls apparently stopped, leaving him alone on an empty highway with a situation that made no sense, and a caller who seemed to be in genuine distress but couldn't be found. Dispatch came back, and the tone in the dispatcher's voice was troubled. "Sheriff, I've got information on that call sign. CB unit Charlie November 650 is registered to a commercial driver named Maeve Hollis out of Billings. She drives a blue Peterbilt 579 for a refrigerated freight company based in Great Falls. And Sheriff, Maeve Hollis was involved in a fatal single-vehicle accident on Route 19 approximately 6 hours ago. The accident occurred in Park County, about 80 miles south of your current location. Montana Highway Patrol worked the scene. Driver was pronounced dead at the scene." Hiram felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather settle into his chest. "Are you telling me I've been receiving distress calls from someone who died this afternoon?" "That's what the system shows, Sheriff. I've got the Highway Patrol incident report right here. Single vehicle accident at approximately 3:45 p.m. Blue Peterbilt registered to Maeve Hollis left the roadway during a snowstorm and rolled multiple times. Driver was not wearing a seatbelt and was ejected from the vehicle. Fatal injuries consistent with high-speed impact. The vehicle was hauling refrigerated freight that was destroyed in the accident." Hiram sat in his patrol unit, staring at the falling snow and trying to process what he was being told. How is it possible that I'm receiving CB transmissions from a dead woman's radio? There was a pause. "I don't know, Sheriff, but the call sign is definitely registered to her unit, and the transmissions are definitely coming from somewhere on Route 19. Maybe someone found her CB and is using it as a prank. That doesn't make sense. The person calling for help described the exact same type of vehicle and cargo that Hollis was hauling. They're describing mechanical problems consistent with what might have led to her accident. How would someone know those details unless they were actually Maeve Hollis?" Before dispatch could respond, Hiram's CB radio crackled to life again, and what he heard made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Multiple voices now, overlapping and interfering with each other, all calling for help on Route 19, all reporting mechanical problems or accidents or situations that required immediate assistance. The voices varied in gender and age, some calm and professional, others panicked and desperate, but they all had the same underlying quality, that distorted, stretched sound like recordings played at wrong speeds. "This is Unit Delta Whiskey 312, reporting engine fire on Route 19 southbound, mile marker 45. Request immediate assistance. This is Unit Alpha Charlie 907. I've got a tire blowout and I've lost control. Vehicle is rolling. Oh God, I'm rolling. Help me. This is Unit Bravo. November 228. Multiple vehicle accident ahead. Route 19 northbound near mile marker 38. I can see vehicles off the road, people walking around. Need ambulances immediately. The voices continued, creating a chaos of distress calls that all seemed to be happening simultaneously on Route 19, reporting accidents and breakdowns and emergencies at multiple locations along the highway. Hiram grabbed his radio and called dispatch with more urgency than he'd intended. "Dispatch, are you receiving these CB transmissions? I've got multiple distress calls coming in on Channel 9, all reporting emergencies on Route 19. We need to get units responding to these locations immediately." There was a long pause, and then dispatch came back, sounding confused. "Sheriff, I'm monitoring Channel 9 and I'm not hearing anything except standard traffic. No distress calls, no emergency transmissions. Just routine chatter." "That's impossible. I'm hearing at least 6 different voices right now, all calling for help." "Hold on, let me record this and send it to you." Hiram activated the recording function on his patrol radio and held the mic close to his CB speaker, capturing the overlapping voices that continued to call for help, reporting accidents that seemed to span the entire length of Route 19 through Morgan County. After 30 seconds, he stopped the recording and transmitted it to dispatch. "Did you receive that?" There was another pause, longer this time. "Sheriff, I received your recording, but there's nothing on it except static. No voices, no transmissions, just background noise." Hiram felt reality shift slightly, the familiar landscape of Route 19 suddenly feeling foreign and threatening in a way it never had before. He was hearing voices that dispatch couldn't hear, receiving distress calls that the recording equipment couldn't capture, pursuing a disabled truck that existed only as a transmission on a radio frequency. He keyed his CB mic, cutting through the chaos of voices. "This is Morgan County Sheriff Hiram Doss on Channel 9. I need all units reporting emergencies to identify your exact locations and the nature of your situations. I have units standing by to respond, but I need accurate information." The overlapping voices stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. And then a single voice came through, clear and undistorted for the first time, recognizable as the female voice that had originally called for help. "Sheriff Doss, this is Maeve Hollis. I need you to understand something. We're not where you are, we're where we were." Hiram gripped his mic, his hand shaking slightly. "Maeve, I don't understand what you're telling me. Where are you?" The voice responded patiently, with the tone of someone explaining something complicated to someone who wasn't quite grasping it. "Sheriff, every one of us on this channel died on Route 19. Some of us years ago, some of us today. We're stuck here, trapped in the moments when we needed help, calling out on the emergency frequency because that's what we were taught to do when things went wrong. But nobody can hear us except you, and apparently you can't help us because we're not in your now. We're in our thens." Hiram sat in his patrol unit, watching the snow fall and listening to a dead woman explain that he was receiving transmissions from the past, from moments frozen in time when people had called for help that either arrived too late or never arrived at all. "Are all of you dead?" The voice that responded wasn't Maeve's but male, older, with the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent decades smoking. "Dead or dying, Sheriff. I've been calling for help from mile marker 45 for 7 years now. Engine fire in my truck, couldn't get out fast enough. Burned to death before the fire department arrived. Now I just keep calling, same transmission over and over, hoping someone will hear me in time to make a difference." Another voice, younger, panicked. "I rolled my truck 5 years ago during a winter storm. Called for help, but the weather was so bad nobody could get to me for hours. By the time they arrived, I'd frozen to death. Now I'm still here, still calling, still hoping someone will come before it's too late. The voices continued, each one telling a story of death on Route 19, accidents and breakdowns and emergencies that had ended in tragedy because help arrived too late, or because the circumstances were beyond what help could address. They were truckers and travelers, commercial drivers, and people just trying to get home, all of them connected by the common experience of dying alone on a highway in rural Montana, calling for help that never came in time. Hiram found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Why am I hearing you now? Why tonight?" Maeve's voice came back, and it sounded sad. "Because you're listening, Sheriff. Most people don't monitor CB Channel 9 anymore. Everyone uses cell phones now, even truckers. The emergency frequency is mostly empty except for people like us, stuck in our moments, transmitting into the void. But tonight you were listening, and somehow the conditions were right for us to reach you. The snow, maybe, or the isolation, or just the particular alignment of where you were and when we were. I don't know why it works. I just know that for the first time since I died, someone can hear me calling." "Can I help you?" Hiram asked, though he already knew the answer. The laugh that came through the radio was bitter, but not unkind. "We're dead, Sheriff. The only help that mattered needed to arrive before we died, and it didn't. Now we just keep calling because that's what we were doing when we died, and apparently that's what we'll keep doing forever. We're not ghosts, exactly. More like echoes. Recordings of desperate moments playing on repeat on a frequency nobody monitors anymore." Hiram sat with that information for a long time, watching the snow fall and listening to the quiet hiss of his radio. Finally, he keyed his mic. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you. All of you. I'm sorry help didn't arrive in time." There was a pause, and then Maeve's voice came back, warmer than before. "Thank you for trying, Sheriff. Thank you for listening. Most people drive right past us now, can't hear us calling, don't know we're here. It means something that you stopped, that you searched, that you tried to help, even though we're beyond helping." Over the following months, Hiram continued to monitor CB Channel 9 during his patrols, particularly on nights when the weather was bad and the highway was empty. He heard the voices regularly now, distress calls from people who died on Route 19, each one trapped in their moment of crisis, calling for help that would never arrive. He started documenting the transmissions, matching call signs to accident reports, confirming that each voice he heard corresponded to a real person who'd died on this highway, their final acts caught in some kind of temporal loop that replayed whenever conditions were right. He learned the regulars. Maeve Hollis, calling about mechanical failure at mile marker 32. James Rutherford, reporting an engine fire at mile marker 45. Sarah Chen, describing a rollover accident at mile marker 38. Dozens of others, each one with their own story, their own final moments, their own desperate calls for help that echoed across years or decades, transmitted on a frequency that fewer and fewer people monitored as technology moved on and left behind the old ways of communication. Hiram started responding to the calls, acknowledging the distress reports even though he couldn't provide the help they needed. He learned that his responses seemed to provide some comfort, that knowing someone was listening made the trapped moments somehow more bearable for the voices caught in them. He became a regular presence on Channel 9, the sheriff who monitored the emergency frequency and responded to ghosts, providing acknowledgement if not assistance, offering human connection to people who'd died alone and afraid. The highway patrol thought he was developing an obsession with CB radio culture. His deputies thought he was spending too much time alone on empty highways, but Hiram kept monitoring Channel 9, kept responding to calls that no one else could hear, kept providing what comfort he could to people trapped in their final moments, calling for help that had arrived too late or not at all. He started carrying a notebook where he documented each transmission, recording the call signs and the stories and the circumstances of the deaths that had created these temporal echoes. The notebook grew thick with entries, each one representing a life that had ended on Route 19. Each one a reminder that rural highways were dangerous places where help could be a long time coming and sometimes came too late to matter. One night in late autumn, almost 8 months after he'd first heard Maeve Hollis calling for help, Hiram was patrolling Route 19 when he came across an accident in progress. A blue semi-truck, similar to the one Maeve had been driving, had slid off the road and was tilted at a dangerous angle in the ditch, hazard lights flashing, exhaust visible in the cold air. Hiram pulled up behind the truck and approached carefully, finding the driver standing beside his vehicle, unhurt but clearly shaken. The driver was young, maybe 30, and introduced himself as Marcus Webb, a commercial driver hauling refrigerated freight from Great Falls to Billings. "I lost traction on black ice," the driver explained. "Went into the ditch before I could correct. I think the trailer's damaged, but I'm okay. I was just about to call for a tow truck." Hiram helped the driver assess the situation and called for a tow service, staying on scene until help arrived. As he was finishing his incident report, he noticed the driver's CB radio, mounted on the dash of the truck, tuned to Channel 9. "You monitor the emergency frequency?" Hiram asked. The driver nodded. "Always do. You never know when someone's going to need help out here. These highways can be lonely places." Hiram felt something settle in his chest, a small sense of comfort that cut through the cold night air. Keep monitoring it. Sometimes people call for help on Channel 9 and they need someone to respond, even if all you can do is acknowledge that you heard them. The driver looked at him oddly, but nodded. "Will do, Sheriff." Hiram drove away from the accident scene, leaving the driver in the hands of the tow service, and continued his patrol along Route 19. His CB radio was quiet for the first few miles, just the standard traffic of truckers communicating about road conditions and rest stop locations. But then, as he passed mile marker 32, he heard a familiar voice. "Sheriff Doss, this is Maeve Hollis. I just wanted to thank you for stopping tonight, for helping that driver. He was close to where I went off the road. Maybe close to when I went off the road too, in some way that doesn't quite make sense in linear time. You being there, helping him, it feels like it matters somehow. Like maybe helping others is a way of helping us too, even if we're beyond direct help." Hiram keyed his mic, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "Maeve, I'll keep monitoring Channel 9. I'll keep responding to calls. All of you deserve to know someone's listening, that your calls for help aren't going unheard. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know." Hiram continued his patrol, driving through the cold Montana night with his CB radio tuned to Channel 9, monitoring the emergency frequency that carried voices from the past, echoes of desperate moments when people had called for help and died waiting for it to arrive. He couldn't change what had happened to them, couldn't rewrite the endings of their stories. But he could listen, could respond, could provide the acknowledgement that someone heard them calling and cared that they'd needed help. In the isolated spaces of rural Montana, where highways stretched for miles without services and accidents could leave you stranded until rescue finally found you, that listening might be the only help he could provide. But it was something, and sometimes something was enough. Sheriff Rowan Kincaid was reviewing the third accident report in as many weeks when she realized the pattern, and the realization came with the particular chill that accompanied discoveries you wished you hadn't made. All 3 accidents had occurred at the same location, the timberline turnout on Route 47, where the highway curved through dense forest in the mountains west of town, and all 3 had involved drivers who claimed to have seen something in the road that wasn't there when investigators arrived to work the scene. It was 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the autumn light coming through her office window had that golden quality that came just before the season turned hard toward winter, when the trees were at peak color and the temperature dropped fast once the sun went down. Pierce County sat in the Cascade Range foothills of Washington state, where mountains rose steep and sudden from the valley floor, and forests were so dense you could walk 50 feet from a road and disappear completely into wilderness that had barely changed since before humans arrived. The county covered 1,100 square miles with a population of about 19,000, most of them living in the county seat of Ridgemont, or in the smaller communities that clustered along the valleys where land was flat enough for building. Route 47 was the main artery connecting Ridgemont to the mountain communities to the west, a 2-lane highway that climbed steadily through forest, following the contours of the landscape and offering spectacular views when weather permitted visibility beyond the immediate roadside. The timberline turnout was a widened shoulder about 12 miles west of Ridgemont, originally created as a scenic overlook where tourists could pull off safely and take photographs of the valley below. But the trees had grown in over the years, obscuring the view, and now it served mainly as an emergency pull-off or a place where logging trucks could stop to check their loads before descending into town. The turnout sat at a curve in the highway where the road bent sharply to the left as it rounded a ridge, and the combination of the curve and the surrounding forest created conditions that could be challenging, especially in fog or low-light situations when visibility was reduced. Rowan had been sheriff of Pierce County for 6 years, and before that she'd spent 9 years with the Washington State Patrol, working highway accidents across the western part of the state. She knew Route 47 well, had worked dozens of accidents on it over the years, understood the particular hazards that came with mountain driving, where curves were sharp and margins for error were small. But the recent cluster of accidents at Timberline Turnout was unusual, not just because of the frequency but because of the consistency of the driver's statements. Each one claimed to have seen multiple people standing in the road, figures that appeared suddenly in their headlights forcing emergency braking that sent vehicles into skids or off the road entirely. And each time, when Rowan or her deputies arrived to investigate, there was no one there. The first accident had occurred 3 weeks ago on a Sunday evening when a family returning from a camping trip had come around the curve at Timberline Turnout and encountered what they described as a group of 5 or 6 people standing in the middle of the road. The driver, a man named Silas Bracken, who worked as a logger in the area and knew Route 47 well, had braked hard and swerved to avoid the figures. His truck had gone off the road and struck a tree, causing significant damage to the vehicle, but only minor injuries to the occupants. When Rowan had arrived at the scene, Silas had been adamant about what he'd seen. "There were people in the road, Sheriff. I saw them clear as day in my headlights. 5 or 6 of them, just standing there like they were waiting for something. I didn't have time to identify them or call out. I just reacted, tried to avoid hitting them." Rowan had searched the area thoroughly that night, checking the roadside and the forest beyond for any sign of the people Silas described. She'd found nothing. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been standing in the road, no witnesses who could corroborate the sighting. The accident had been classified as failure to maintain control due to driver error, though Rowan had included Silas's statement about the figures in her report because he'd been so certain about what he'd seen. The second accident had occurred a week later, this time involving a delivery driver who'd been traveling the route regularly for years. The driver, a woman in her 40s, had described seeing 3 people standing at the edge of the road near the turnout, reflective clothing visible in her headlights. She'd slowed down, expecting them to move, but as she'd gotten closer, the figures had seemed to multiply. 3 becoming 6, becoming 9, spreading across both lanes in a way that forced her to brake hard. Her van had skidded on leaves that were slick from recent rain, spinning into the ditch and rolling onto its side. The driver had escaped with minor injuries, but she'd been shaken badly, insisting that the people had been real, that she'd seen them clearly, that there was no way her eyes had deceived her about something so obvious. Again, Rowan had searched the area and found nothing. No people, no evidence of anyone having been present, just the empty road and the forest pressing in close on both sides. The third accident, which had occurred just 2 nights ago, had involved a young couple driving home from a concert in Seattle. They'd described seeing a crowd of people at Timberline Turnout, maybe 15 or 20 individuals, all wearing reflective gear that lit up brilliantly in the headlights. The driver had stopped completely, expecting the crowd to clear the road, but when he'd turned on his high beams to get a better look, the figures had seemed to be everywhere. Not just in front of the vehicle, but beside it and behind it, surrounding the car in a way that created panic. The driver had accelerated suddenly, lost control on the curve, and crashed through the guardrail, the vehicle coming to rest precariously on the steep slope below the road. Both occupants had survived with moderate injuries, and both insisted they'd been surrounded by people who'd then vanished when rescue workers arrived. Rowan sat in her office, staring at the 3 incident reports and trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening. The location was consistent. The time frame was clustering around autumn evenings when fog was common and visibility was reduced, and the witness statements were remarkably similar despite coming from people who had no connection to each other and no reason to fabricate the same story. She picked up her phone and called Deputy Faye Lathrop, who'd worked 2 of the 3 accident scenes and might have insights that weren't captured in the written reports. "Faye, it's Rowan. I want to talk to you about the Timberline Turnout accidents." Faye Lathrop had been with the department for 8 years, a detail-oriented deputy with a background in accident reconstruction who noticed things other people missed. "What about them, Sheriff? Do you think there's something unusual about these cases? Beyond the obvious pattern of drivers reporting people in the road that we can't find any evidence of?" "I think there's something wrong with that location. I've been out there 3 times now, working accident scenes, and every time I'm there I get this feeling like something's off. The way the light reflects off the fog, maybe, or the way sound carries in the trees. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it feels disorienting." Rowan made a note. "Have you noticed anything specific? Visual anomalies, equipment malfunctions, anything that might explain why multiple drivers are seeing the same thing?" Faye was quiet for a moment. "The reflectors, Sheriff. There are reflectors mounted along the guardrail at the turnout, the kind that are supposed to help mark the road edge at night. But when the fog's heavy, those reflectors create strange effects. They seem to multiply or move or reflect light in ways that don't quite make sense. I've stood there trying to figure out what I'm seeing, and even knowing they're just reflectors, it's easy to trick your brain into thinking there's something else." Rowan felt something click into place. "You're saying the reflectors could be creating an illusion that drivers are interpreting as people in the road. It's possible. Add in the stress of driving a dangerous curve in poor visibility, the way headlights interact with fog, maybe some sleep deprivation or distraction, and you could have a perfect storm of conditions that create a convincing visual illusion. But Sheriff, that doesn't explain why all 3 drivers reported the same number of figures in roughly the same configuration. If it's just reflectors and fog creating random patterns, you'd expect more variation in what people see." That was exactly what bothered Rowan. The consistency of the witness statements suggested they were seeing something real, or at least something that had enough reality to be perceived the same way by different observers. She thanked Faye and ended the call, then grabbed her jacket and keys. She wanted to visit Timberline Turnout herself, wanted to see what conditions were like at the location, wanted to understand what combination of factors might be creating these dangerous illusions. The drive up Route 47 took her through forests that were brilliant with autumn color. Maples and alders turned gold and red against the dark green of the Douglas firs and hemlocks that dominated the higher elevations. The road climbed steadily, curves becoming sharper as the elevation increased, and the temperature dropping enough that she could see her breath when she finally pulled off at Timberline Turnout and got out of her vehicle. The turnout was wider than the typical shoulder, maybe 40 feet deep, with a guardrail separating it from the steep drop below. The reflectors Faye had mentioned were mounted at regular intervals along the guardrail, small rectangular devices that caught light and threw it back toward the road, helping drivers navigate the curve safely in low visibility conditions. Rowan walked along the guardrail, examining the reflectors and trying to see what Faye had described. In daylight, they were unremarkable, just standard safety equipment. But as the afternoon light began to fade and shadows lengthened, she started to notice something odd. The reflectors seemed to catch light from unexpected angles, throwing back reflections that appeared to come from sources she couldn't identify. She stood at the curve, looking back toward where drivers would first see the turnout as they rounded the bend, and noticed that the reflectors created a pattern that, in the failing light, could be interpreted as vertical elements, not quite people, but not quite just reflectors either, something ambiguous enough that a tired driver coming around a sharp curve might see them as figures standing along the road. She was about to leave when her radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "Unit 1, this is dispatch. Go ahead. We're getting a report of a single vehicle accident on Route 47 at Timberline Turnout. Ambulance is responding. Caller reports the vehicle is off the road, driver's condition unknown." Rowan felt her pulse quicken. "I'm at that location right now. No sign of any accident." Dispatch came back immediately. "Sheriff, the call just came in from a passing motorist who saw the vehicle. They described it as a dark-colored sedan off the road on the downhill side of the turnout. Appeared to have gone through the guardrail." Rowan walked the length of the guardrail, checking for any damage or signs that a vehicle had broken through. The guardrail was intact, showing no recent damage, and there was no vehicle visible on the slope below. "Dispatch, I'm at the guardrail and there's no evidence of any accident here. Are you sure about the location?" "Confirmed, Sheriff. Caller specifically said Timberline Turnout, Route 47. Dark sedan through the guardrail." They were certain about what they saw. Rowan keyed her radio. "Get Deputy Lathrop to respond to this location. I want a second set of eyes on this." While she waited for Faye to arrive, Rowan set up traffic cones to secure the area and walked the perimeter again, this time looking more carefully at the slope below the guardrail. The vegetation was undisturbed, showing no signs of recent passage, and there were no broken branches or disturbed soil that would indicate a vehicle had crashed through. The accident that the caller had reported simply didn't exist, at least not in any physical form she could detect. Faye arrived 15 minutes later, and together they conducted a systematic search of the area. They found nothing. No accident, no vehicle, no explanation for why someone would have called in a report that was apparently completely fabricated. Unless, Rowan thought, the caller had seen the same thing the accident victims had seen, figures or vehicles that appeared to be there but weren't, visual phenomena created by the particular conditions at this location. Faye stood at the guardrail, looking down the slope, her expression troubled. "Sheriff, I think we need to set up surveillance here. Something's happening at this location that we don't understand, and it's creating a safety hazard. People are crashing because they're seeing things that aren't there, or maybe because they're seeing things that are there in some way we can't explain. Either way, we need more information." Rowan agreed. That night, she installed a trail camera at the turnout, positioning it to capture both the road and the guardrail area where drivers reported seeing figures. The camera was motion-activated with infrared capability for nighttime recording, and had stored footage to a SD card that Rowan could review later. She also arranged for regular patrols of Route 47 to increase law enforcement presence in the area and hopefully deter whatever was causing the accidents. Over the following week, the trail camera recorded hundreds of clips, most of them showing normal traffic, vehicles rounding the curve and continuing past the turnout without incident. But there were several clips that showed something else. Footage that Rowan watched multiple times trying to understand what she was seeing. In these clips, vehicles would approach the curve, slow down suddenly as if the drivers had seen something, and then accelerate away quickly. Sometimes the vehicles would brake hard, tires skidding slightly before the drivers regained control and continued. And in a few cases, the vehicles would stop completely, sitting in the road for several seconds before moving on. But the cameras never showed what the drivers were reacting to. The road ahead remained empty, the reflectors along the guardrail showed no unusual activity, and there were no pedestrians or obstacles that could explain the driver's behavior. It was as if the drivers were reacting to something the cameras couldn't capture, something that existed in their perception, but not in objective reality. Rowan brought the footage to a specialist in visual perception at the university in Seattle, a professor who studied how the human brain processed optical information and could be tricked by certain combinations of light and movement. The professor, a man in his 60s named Marcus Cole, watched the footage carefully and then asked to see the location in person. They drove to Timberline Turnout on a foggy evening in early November, conditions similar to when several of the accidents had occurred. Dr. Cole spent an hour at the location, taking measurements, photographing the reflectors, studying the way light interacted with fog and forest. Finally, he stood at the curve where drivers first saw the turnout and watched as a vehicle approached, its headlights cutting through the fog and illuminating the reflectors in a pattern that briefly seemed to suggest vertical shapes before resolving back into reflectors as the angle changed. Sheriff Kincaid, what you have here is a specific type of optical illusion called a pareidolik cascade. The reflectors, combined with fog and the angle of approaching headlights, create a pattern that the human brain interprets as familiar shapes. In this case, people standing along the road. The illusion is enhanced by the stress and vigilance of driving a challenging road, which primes the brain to see potential hazards. Once the brain identifies the pattern as people, it's very difficult to reinterpret it as just reflectors, especially in the brief moment drivers have to react. Can that explain why multiple drivers report seeing the same thing? Dr. Cole nodded. Absolutely. The physical conditions are consistent, the angle of approach is consistent, the position of the reflectors is consistent. Any driver coming through here under similar conditions would be seeing the same optical pattern, and most human brains would interpret it the same way. It's not that the drivers are seeing things that aren't there, it's that they're correctly seeing an optical pattern, but incorrectly interpreting what that pattern represents. Rowan felt some relief at having an explanation, but something still bothered her. Dr. Cole, one of the drivers, reported being surrounded by figures, seeing them not just in front, but beside and behind the vehicle. How would an optical illusion based on fixed reflectors create that effect? The professor was quiet for a moment. That's harder to explain with just the reflector theory. Being surrounded would require either additional light sources creating more reflection points, or it would require the driver's perception to be distorted enough that they're generating visual phenomena internally rather than responding to external stimuli. That can happen under extreme stress, particularly if there's an element of panic or fear influencing the perception. Or, he paused, there could be something else contributing to the illusion that we haven't identified yet. Have you had any reports of equipment malfunctions at this location? Cell phone interference, radio problems, anything like that? Rowan thought about it. Now that you mention it, several of the drivers mentioned their phones acting strange right before the accidents. calls dropping, screens freezing, that sort of thing. And Deputy Lathrop mentioned feeling disoriented when she's at this location. Dr. Cole looked troubled. That suggests there might be an environmental factor we're missing. Electromagnetic interference could affect both electronic equipment and human perception, particularly if it's operating at frequencies that interfere with the brain's normal processing. It's rare, but there are documented cases of localized electromagnetic anomalies creating perceptual distortions. Rowan arranged for a survey team from the State Geology Department to visit Timberline Turnout and conduct measurements of electromagnetic activity, background radiation, and any other environmental factors that might be relevant. The team spent 2 days at the location with sensitive equipment, taking readings at different times of day and under various weather conditions. Their report, delivered a week later, showed something unexpected. There was a localized electromagnetic anomaly at the turnout, a pocket of unusual activity that the geologists couldn't fully explain. The readings suggested interference from underground mineral deposits, possibly combined with natural electrical activity in the atmosphere during foggy conditions. The combination created a low-level electromagnetic field that varied in strength but was consistently present at the location. Could this field affect human perception or electronic equipment? Rowan asked the lead geologist during a phone call to discuss the findings. "It's possible," the geologist replied. "The field strength isn't high enough to cause immediate physical effects, but it could interfere with sensitive electronics like cell phones or vehicle computers. As for human perception, that's outside my expertise. But there's research suggesting that certain electromagnetic frequencies can affect brain function, particularly in areas related to visual processing and spatial awareness." Rowan shared this information with Dr. Cole, who found it fascinating and concerning in equal measure. "Sheriff, what you may have at Timberline Turnout is a perfect storm of factors that combine to create both optical illusions and perceptual distortions. The reflectors create visual patterns that look like people. The electromagnetic field affects how the brain processes those patterns and may create additional perceptual anomalies, and the stress of driving a dangerous curve amplifies both effects. Add in fog and low light, and you have conditions where even experienced drivers could have accidents, because they're reacting to perceptions that don't match physical reality." The question was what to do about it. Rowan couldn't close Route 47. It was a major artery connecting mountain communities to the valley, and there wasn't a practical alternative route. She considered removing the reflectors, but they served an important safety function, helping drivers navigate the curve at night, and removing them might actually increase accidents rather than prevent them. She increased patrols in the area, posted warning signs about the curve and the need for reduced speed, and issued a press release warning drivers about optical illusions at the location. The accident stopped for several weeks, and Rowan began to hope that the combination of increased awareness and law enforcement presence had solved the problem. But then, on a foggy night in late November, she received a call that made everything worse. Multiple vehicle pileup at Timberline Turnout, Route 47. Ambulance and fire responding. Multiple injuries reported. Rowan arrived to find controlled chaos. 4 vehicles were involved, 2 off the road, 1 rolled onto its side, 1 crushed against the guardrail. Emergency responders were working with injured passengers, extracting people from damaged vehicles, and establishing treatment areas. She found the first deputy on scene, a young officer named Hollis Quaid, who worked part-time with the sheriff's department while completing his EMT certification. "Hollis, what happened here?" The deputy looked shaken. "Sheriff, all 4 drivers reported the same thing. They came around the curve and saw a crowd of people standing in the road. The first driver braked hard, the second driver swerved to avoid the first vehicle, the third driver braked but couldn't stop in time and rear-ended the first vehicle, and the fourth driver tried to go around everyone and lost control, rolled into the ditch." By the time I arrived, all 4 drivers were out of their vehicles, searching the area for the people they'd seen. But Sheriff, there's no one here. No pedestrians. No evidence anyone was standing in the road. Rowan helped coordinate the emergency response, making sure the injured were transported to the hospital and the scene was secured for investigation. As she was interviewing the drivers, trying to piece together exactly what had happened, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The trail camera she'd installed weeks ago was still active, mounted on a tree with a clear view of the road. The footage from that camera should show exactly what had happened, should either confirm or disprove the driver's statements about seeing people in the road. She retrieved the SD card from the camera and reviewed the footage on her laptop in her patrol unit. What she saw didn't make sense. The footage showed the 4 vehicles approaching the curve in sequence, exactly as the drivers had described. But as the first vehicle rounded the curve and entered the frame, the footage began to loop. The same 3 seconds of video repeated over and over, showing the vehicle at the same position, approaching but never quite arriving, stuck in a temporal loop that continued for exactly the duration of the accident. When the loop finally broke and normal footage resumed, all 4 vehicles were already crashed. Emergency lights were flashing, and people were moving around the scene. The actual accident, the moment when vehicles collided and went off the road, was missing from the recording, replaced by a looped segment that showed nothing happening. Rowan watched the footage 5 times, trying to find some technical explanation for what she was seeing. Camera malfunction, SD card corruption, electromagnetic interference affecting the recording equipment. But the footage before and after the loop was clear and normal, showing no signs of malfunction or interference. Only the critical 3 seconds during the accident were affected, replaced with a loop that seemed designed to prevent anyone from seeing what actually happened at Timberline Turnout. She sent the footage to a forensic video analyst who specialized in examining surveillance recordings for law enforcement. The analyst's report came back inconclusive. The looping was there, clearly visible in the data, but there was no obvious technical cause. The footage hadn't been edited or tampered with. The camera's internal clock showed the correct timestamps, and the file format was intact. The loop appeared to be a recording of actual events, 3 seconds that repeated themselves multiple times, as if time itself had stuttered at that location. Rowan stopped sleeping well. She kept thinking about drivers seeing people who weren't there, about camera footage that looped through time, about the electromagnetic anomaly that couldn't fully explain what was happening, but suggested reality at Timberline Turnout wasn't quite stable. She installed additional cameras, hoping that multiple angles would provide clarity, but they all showed the same phenomenon. During accident events, the footage would loop, showing the same few seconds repeatedly until the event was over and normal recording resumed. It was as if something at that location didn't want to be recorded, didn't want its activity documented, and had the ability to interfere with technology in ways that transcended simple electromagnetic interference. The accidents continued sporadically through the winter, always at night, always in fog, always with drivers reporting the same thing. People in the road, figures that multiplied and moved in ways that didn't follow normal physics. Perceptions that forced emergency reactions and led to crashes that the cameras never quite captured. Rowan increased enforcement, tried different warning systems, even lobbied for highway improvements that might reduce the hazard. Nothing worked. Timberline Turnout remained dangerous, claimed vehicles and injured drivers with disturbing regularity, and defied every attempt to understand or prevent what was happening there. In spring, Rowan hired a historian to research the location, hoping that understanding the history might provide insights. What the historian found was disturbing. Timberline turnout hadn't always been a turnout. Before Route 47 was built in 1952, the location had been the site of a logging camp, a temporary community where workers lived during the harvest season. In November 1947, a fire had swept through the camp during the night, killing 19 workers who'd been trapped in their bunkhouse when the only exit became blocked by flames. The bodies had been buried in a mass grave at the site, and the grave had been paved over when the highway was constructed 5 years later. Rowan stood at Timberline Turnout with this knowledge, looking at the innocent-seeming curve in the road and understanding that she was standing on top of a mass grave, that vehicles were driving over the remains of 19 people who'd died sudden violent deaths, trapped and calling for help that never came. The reflectors that created optical illusions were mounted on a guardrail that ran directly over where the bunkhouse had stood. The electromagnetic anomaly might have natural causes, but it was centered on the location where people had died screaming. She contacted the State Highway Department and requested that the road be rerouted, arguing that the location was both dangerous and disrespectful to the dead. The request was denied due to cost and logistical challenges. She contacted Indigenous cultural resources specialists, historians, anyone who might have authority or influence to address the situation. Everyone sympathized, but no one had the power or resources to help. Timberline Turnout remained an active part of Route 47, and the accidents continued. Rowan eventually accepted that she couldn't solve this problem through normal law enforcement methods. Whatever was happening at Timberline Turnout existed at the intersection of optical illusion, electromagnetic anomaly, historical tragedy, and something else that she didn't have words for. Something that created loops in time and made the dead visible to drivers who came too close to the place where they died. She kept monitoring the location, kept responding to accidents, kept trying to minimize harm even though she couldn't eliminate the cause. The trail cameras continued to record footage that looped during accident events, showing 3 seconds repeated endlessly while time stuttered, and drivers crashed and search teams looked for people who'd been dead for 70 years but were still standing in the road at Timberline Turnout, still trying to escape a fire that never stopped burning, still calling for help that would always arrive too late. The siren started wailing at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in mid-January, and Sheriff Tobin Merriweather was awake to hear it because he'd been sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee and reviewing case files, taking advantage of the insomnia that had become his constant companion since his divorce finalized 3 months earlier. The sound cut through the silent winter night with the rising falling wail that was designed to carry for miles, to pull people from sleep with urgent warning of danger approaching from the sky. Except there was no danger, no storm, no attack, no reason for the old civil defense siren to be active because it hadn't been maintained or tested in 20 years and shouldn't have power running to it at all. Chatham County sat in the rolling hills of southern Iowa, where farmland gave way to scattered timber and small communities that had changed very little since they were founded in the 1800s. The county covered 700 square miles with a population of about 11,000, most of them living in the county seat of Meridian, a classic small Iowa town with a courthouse square and neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. The civil defense siren sat on top of the old water tower at the edge of town, a relic from the Cold War era when communities across America had installed warning systems to alert citizens of nuclear attack. The siren in Meridian had been installed in 1962, tested monthly for decades, and finally decommissioned in the late 90s when the cost of maintaining the system couldn't be justified. It had sat silent and inactive for over 20 years, its internal mechanisms rusted, its power supply disconnected, and yet now it was wailing, loud enough to wake the entire town. Tobin pulled on his jacket and boots and was out the door within 2 minutes, radioing dispatch as he started his patrol unit. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. I'm responding to the siren activation. Get maintenance out there to shut it down and find out how the hell a decommissioned system is operating. Copy that, Sheriff. We're getting multiple calls about the siren. People are scared. Tell them it's a malfunction. There's no emergency. As Tobin drove through the empty streets, he could see lights coming on in houses, people appearing at windows to look toward the sound, some coming outside despite the cold to stand in their yards and stare at the water tower where the siren continued its mechanical wail. He arrived at the water tower to find it surrounded by a chain-link fence with no signs of tampering, the gate still locked. The siren itself was mounted on a platform at the top of the tower, maybe 60 feet up, accessible only with a key to the gate and the ladder. He called dispatch. I'm at the water tower. The gate's locked, no signs of forced entry. Is maintenance responding? They're on their way, Sheriff. ETA about 10 minutes. The siren continued to wail, and Tobin noticed something odd about the sound. The pitch was correct, the rhythm was correct, but there was a quality to it that seemed strained, as if the mechanisms were working against resistance that shouldn't be there. And then, abruptly, the siren stopped. The silence that followed was profound, made more intense by the absence of sound that had filled the night for 15 minutes. The maintenance supervisor arrived with keys and a confused expression. Sheriff, I don't understand how this is possible. That siren's been disconnected for 20 years. We cut the power lines when we decommissioned it. They climbed the ladder together, and when they opened the cabinet housing the siren's mechanisms, they both stared at what was inside. The internal components were corroded and frozen, the wiring was disconnected, and there was no power supply attached. The system was completely inert, incapable of producing sound. Sheriff, this thing hasn't been operational in decades. The motor's seized, the amplifier's dead, and there's no power. It's physically impossible for it to have made the sound we all heard. Tobin's radio crackled with a call from dispatch. Unit 1, we're getting reports of suspicious activity from multiple locations around town. Multiple callers reporting someone standing on their front porch or at their door. Do you want me to send deputies to respond? Tobin felt cold. That had nothing to do with the temperature. What do you mean, multiple locations? How many calls? We've got 6 calls so far. All came in within the last few minutes. Addresses are spread across different neighborhoods. Callers are reporting a figure standing at their door, not knocking, just standing there. When they look out to see who it is, the figure's gone. Tobin drove to the first address, the home of Pastor Orrin Talbot, who ran the Methodist Church. Orrin was waiting on his porch when Tobin arrived, a bathrobe over his pajamas and a troubled expression on his face. Sheriff, I know it sounds crazy, but I swear there was someone standing at my door. I heard footsteps on the porch, heard them stop right in front of the door. When I looked through the peephole, I could see a figure standing there, but it was dark and I couldn't make out details. I called out, but there was no response. When I turned on the porch light and opened the door, no one was there. Tobin examined the porch with his flashlight and found what he was looking for. Footprints in the thin layer of frost, showing the distinctive tread pattern of work boots. The prints approached the door from the porch steps, stopped directly in front of the door, and then nothing. There were no prints leading away. The second house belonged to Della Rios, who worked the night shift at the convenience store and had just gotten home when she heard someone on her porch. Her story was identical. Footsteps approaching, stopping at the door, no response when she called out, and the figure gone when she opened the door. And, like at Orrin's house, Tobin found footprints that approached the door but didn't lead away. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th houses all showed the same pattern. Residents hearing footsteps, seeing figures through windows or peepholes, finding no one there when they investigated, and footprints that approached doors but mysteriously disappeared. Tobin photographed everything, documented the locations, tried to find rational explanation. The footprints were real and all showed the same tread pattern, suggesting a single person. But the logistics didn't make sense. The houses were separated by distances that would take 15 or 20 minutes to walk. All the incidents had occurred within about 10 minutes. By sunrise, Tobin had responded to 11 reports, all following the same pattern, all occurring after the siren had stopped. None of it made sense through the lens of rational investigation, yet all of it was documented and verified by multiple witnesses. That night, the same thing happened again. At 2:47 a.m., exactly 24 hours after the first activation, the civil defense siren began to wail. Tobin was positioned near the water tower with Deputy Pearl Winscott, both watching the siren. The sound began without warning, and they watched as the siren housing remained completely still, showing no vibration or movement that would indicate internal mechanisms operating. They climbed the ladder and confirmed what they'd found before. The mechanisms were frozen, the power was disconnected, and there was no conceivable way for the system to be producing sound. But the sound continued, loud enough to rattle their teeth, emanating from a device that shouldn't be capable of producing anything. The siren stopped after 15 minutes, and immediately reports began coming in. Multiple callers reporting figures at doors, same pattern as the night before, spread across different neighborhoods. Tobin and Pearl split up and spent the next 3 hours documenting the same phenomenon. Footsteps approaching, figures visible through peepholes or windows, no one there when doors opened, and footprints that approached but never departed. Over the following week, the pattern repeated itself nightly. At 2:47 a.m., the siren would activate, wailing for exactly 15 minutes. Immediately after it stopped, figures would appear at doors across Meridian, visiting houses in a pattern that seemed random but eventually covered most neighborhoods. Residents were terrified, installing additional locks and security systems that did nothing to prevent the visits. Tobin increased patrols, positioned deputies throughout town during the critical time window, tried every strategy he could think of to catch whoever was responsible. They never saw anyone. The figures appeared at doors when no deputies were watching that specific location, disappeared before anyone could investigate, and left behind only the mysterious footprints. Tobin sent photographs to a forensic specialist who confirmed they were real, showed weight distribution consistent with a person of average build, and all appeared to have been made by the same shoe. But the specialist couldn't explain how the prints could appear without corresponding departure tracks. Desperate for answers, Tobin researched the history of Meridian. What he found was disturbing but potentially relevant. In January 1962, the same month and date that the civil defense siren had been installed, there had been a tragedy. A house fire had killed a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 children, who'd been trapped inside when fire blocked their exits. The fire had started in the early morning hours, around 3 a.m., and by the time neighbors noticed and called for help, it was too late. The family had died of smoke inhalation before firefighters could reach them. The incident had traumatized the town, led to changes in fire codes and the installation of the siren system. And now, 63 years later, something was activating that siren at approximately the same time the fire had occurred, and something was visiting houses throughout town as if checking on residents, making sure they were aware of danger. Tobin researched the footprint pattern more carefully and discovered something chilling. The shoe size and tread pattern matched boots that had been common in the early 1960s, specifically a work boot style no longer manufactured. He checked the fire incident report from 1962 and found that the father who died had been a construction worker who wore size 11 work boots, the same size as the mysterious prints. He visited the cemetery where the family was buried and found their graves clustered together, marking deaths that had occurred on January 15, 1962, exactly 63 years ago to the day when the siren activations had begun. Tobin stood at those graves and understood what was happening. The father who'd died in the fire, who'd been unable to save his family, who'd failed in the most fundamental responsibility of keeping his loved ones safe, was still trying to warn people. The siren that had been installed in response to his family's death was activating on the anniversary, powered not by electricity but by whatever force allowed the dead to reach back when their purpose was strong enough. The footprints that approached doors but never departed weren't physically walking away, because they weren't physical in the normal sense. They were impressions left by someone who no longer had physical form, someone who could appear at multiple locations simultaneously because linear space didn't apply. Someone checking on the living, making sure they were aware, making sure they could respond if danger came. Tobin shared this theory with no one, knowing it would sound insane. Instead, he continued to respond to calls, document footprints, reassure residents they were safe, even though he didn't fully understand what was visiting them. The nightly pattern continued through the end of January, the siren sounding at 2:47 each morning, the figures appearing at doors immediately after. And then, on February 1st, it stopped. The siren remained silent. The figures stopped appearing. The footprints no longer manifested. Whatever anniversary had needed to be marked or warning given was apparently complete. 6 months later, Tobin received a call from a resident who'd been reviewing old newspapers. Sheriff, the family that died in the fire in 1962, lived at 247 Oak Street. That house burned down and was rebuilt in 1963. The new house has a different address now. What's the current address? 1247 East Main Street. That's the convenience store where Della Rios works. Tobin felt pieces clicking into place, because Della Rios was the first person you responded to. And if you check the other addresses, you'll find that several are houses that existed in 1962, houses where residents would have been sleeping when the fire started, houses where the father might have tried to alert people if he'd been able to get out. Tobin checked the addresses against a historical map from 1962. The pattern was clear. Almost every house where figures had been reported was a residence that had existed 63 years ago, that would have been occupied when the fire occurred, that could have received warning if someone had been able to run through town alerting people to danger. The father who'd died trying to save his family was still trying to save everyone else. Still running through Meridian on the anniversary of his death. Still checking that people were aware, that they could respond, that they wouldn't be trapped. Tobin returned to the cemetery and stood at the grave of Thomas Mitchell, the father who'd died in the fire, and spoke quietly. "I understand what you've been doing, Mr. Mitchell. I understand you're trying to help, trying to make sure what happened to your family doesn't happen to anyone else. But the people are scared. If you can hear me, I want you to know that we've learned from what happened. We have smoke detectors now, fire codes, emergency systems. The town is safer because of the changes that came after the fire. You don't need to keep warning us. You can rest now." The following January, as the anniversary approached, Tobin prepared for the siren to activate again. But January 15th came and went without incident. The siren remained silent. No figures appeared, no footprints manifested. The anniversary passed quietly. Tobin returned to the cemetery on January 16th and noticed something new. Someone had placed fresh flowers on the grave, winter roses arranged carefully at the base of the headstone. There was a small card attached. "Thank you for watching over us. You can rest now. We're safe." He never learned who'd left the flowers, though he suspected it might have been one of the residents who'd seen the figures, who'd understood what had been happening, who'd wanted to acknowledge the gesture. The siren remained silent for another year, then another, until the town finally decided to remove it during a water tower renovation. The day it was dismantled, Tobin watched from below. and found himself hoping that Thomas Mitchell felt some relief that his vigil was over. The footprints never appeared again. The figures stopped visiting doors. Meridian returned to being a quiet Iowa town where people felt safe sleeping through the night. But sometimes, late at night when Tobin drove through empty streets on patrol, he thought he saw movement in his peripheral vision, someone walking with purpose through the darkness, checking on houses, making sure people were home and no one was in danger. He never turned his head to look directly, never tried to confirm what he thought he was seeing, because some questions were better left unasked, and some watchers were better acknowledged through peripheral respect. Thomas Mitchell might be resting, or he might still be walking through Meridian on cold January nights, unable to fully let go of the responsibility he'd failed to fulfill in life. Either way, the town was safe. And if the reason it remained safe was partly because someone who'd died failing to protect his family still watched over everyone else's families, Tobin could live with that. Some protectors continued their vigil beyond death, and sometimes the best thing law enforcement could do was acknowledge their presence and move forward.